Welcome to the German Council on Foreign Relations, DGAP, and welcome to this week's edition of our Thursday morning briefings. My name is Jan Stöckmann, and I'm head of the Director's Office here at DGAP. It is my great pleasure to be chairing this morning's briefing. Out of the 450 million people in Europe, about 350 million are eligible to vote in the European Parliament election, held from today, the 6th of June, until Sunday, the 9th of June, across the EU's 27 member states. This election is more important than ever, Timothy Garton-Ash said in a recent interview for Internationale Politik, DGAP's House magazine. It is so important, he went on, because Europe is facing Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but also because populists are on the rise. And while not likely to gain any majorities, they will certainly disrupt the formation of political groups in the next parliament. Most prominently, as we heard, Commission President and European People's Party lead candidate Ursula von der Leyen has faced criticism for her courtship of Italy's Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni. Things are complicated. There are no clear-cut political groups yet. We have seen friction and rifts on the political spectrum, especially on the populist spectrum, with Germany's AfD being kicked out of the Identity and Democracy group in the European Parliament after several scandals just last month. Now, regardless of the exact results, which we can spend some time speculating on, there will almost certainly be a somewhat shift to the right. What does this imply for the political priorities of the next Commission? How does it reflect various national trends? What are the key topics and drivers of this election? And what are we to make of the various forms of political extremism and violence that we've seen across Europe in recent months? These are just some of the questions that I'm delighted to be discussing with our excellent speakers and you today. Our first speaker is Stanley Pignal, who is the Brussels bureau chief and Charlemagne columnist of The Economist. Previously, he reported on economics and business out of Paris and Mumbai, and before joining The Economist, wrote for the Financial Times. Welcome, Stanley. Next will be Professor Christine Reh, who is Professor of European Politics at the Hertie School in Berlin. Professor Reh received her PhD from the European University Institute in Florence and held previous academic positions at the College of Europe in Bruges and Cologne. Her research focuses on European Union's institutions, politics and legitimacy, decision-making processes, as well as informal governance and politicization. Welcome, Christine. Last but not least, our own Milan, who's a senior research fellow in DGAP's Center for Order and Governance in Eastern Europe, Russia, and Central Asia. Milan previously worked inter alia as a journalist and think tanker, among other positions heading the Europe program at Globsec in Bratislava. And he has advised various governments and institutions and keeps a close eye on EU affairs in general. Welcome to the morning briefing, Milan.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Now, before we begin, just a few housekeeping announcements. We would like to remind everyone that this event is being recorded and will be uploaded subsequently. We will kick off our conversation here on the panel with about 5 minutes of intro remarks each, and then open up for questions and answers after about 30 minutes. If you'd like to ask a question during the Q&A, please raise your hand, virtually or otherwise. And when invited to speak, briefly introduce yourself and keep your question or comment relatively short so we can pick up as many as possible. Finally, just a word of thanks to all my colleagues here at DGAP supporting this morning briefing series, Henning Hoff, Julia Löwer, Mega Beck, and others. Now, without much further ado, can I ask you, Stanley, to give us an overview of the key election topics and perhaps also a bit of a comparative look at the campaigns across Europe? There's so much going on. Can you help us make sense of it?
Yeah. Thank you, Jan. Thanks for having me. Welcome to any Dutch participants who will be voting today. I think they're the only ones in Europe who vote today, and the rest of us will be trudging to the polls at some point over the weekend. What are these elections about? A year ago, I wrote that the West faced two major elections in 2024 in America and the EU. And one of those elections was going to have a huge impact on Europe, potentially reshaping its entire political landscape, and that the other election was going to elect members of the European Parliament. Now, that is maybe a little bit unfair. It speaks a little bit to the concern that we have in Europe about the potential rise of Donald Trump. But it also speaks to another truth, which is Pace, Timothy Garton-Ash, European elections remain in Europe second-tier elections. They're sometimes compared to midterms in the US, and I think that's about right. So far, and we've had direct elections since 1979, we have never seen them have a clear and immediate political consequence, like you would see, for example, in the French elections in 2027. If Marine Le Pen wins in 2027, France will be a very, very different place the morning after than if she doesn't win. Same thing in the Netherlands. The Netherlands is a different place now than it was in November after Wilders did so well. Indeed, the US will look very, very different in November if Trump wins versus Biden. European citizens still see European politics through the prism of their domestic politics. I've been following the French campaign. I am French. And what you see is that the campaign is overwhelmingly a domestic political campaign. People talk about domestic political issues, and some of the more pro-European candidates try to bring in their experience in the European Parliament. But by and large, we've heard things about retirement ages. We have heard things about the hospital system. We have heard things about the social system, none of which Europe has any real competence on. And my suspicion is, nobody can follow the 27 campaigns that are happening across the EU, but my suspicion is that that's the case in many different European countries. A few pan-European themes have emerged. There are three that come to mind. The first is around the Green Deal. And I think more generally, the idea that, does Europe nag too much? Does it do too much? Does it regulate too much? Are we getting too much imposed from Brussels? And the Green Deal is something that people can understand. They know, they've heard that internal combustion engines are going to be not going to be sold in the EU after 2035. They have a sense of the costs and also of the real benefits, obviously, that come with the Green Deal. So that's one. And they also understand that this is something which is important to be handled at the European level. It makes no sense for Luxembourg to do something or Spain to do something if others aren't doing it. The second key theme is migration. I don't know how much this is tied to the recent migration pact. I think it's just that migration is an issue in all European countries. It affects different European countries in different ways. But this speaks also to the rise of the hard right that is going to be a key theme of our discussion today. So migration is something that is important. Some people blame Brussels. Some people think Brussels is the solution. But I think that's a recurring theme. And the third one is kind of more of a gut feeling. Is a politician standing for the European elections, are they for Europe or are they against Europe? Are they more on the Macron side in the French case, or are they more on the Le Pen side? Are they more on the centrist CDU, CSU, SPD side, or are they more on the AFD side? And this is a debate that I think you see across the spectrum. There will be two upshots to these European elections. One of them is on domestic politics. A lot of national politicians will wake up on June 10th having had a very bad night. It'll be a bloody nose, certainly for Emmanuel Macron in France, for example. The extent of the loss that his party is expected to face in France, I think, will lead to a domestic political reckoning. I think the same will be true, for example, in Germany. The list of countries that I'm keeping an eye on, and everybody will have their own, but I think, France and Germany, because they're so big and because there's a hard right story, I think are going to be interesting. In the Netherlands and in Poland, you will have two governments getting early report cards. And so a sense of how they're doing. Spain, I think, is interesting because of Sanchez. How will people have reacted to his kind of mini sabbatical and him trying to relaunch his political career? And then Hungary as well. Is there a new opposition to Orban that could constrain him. So that's the first upshot, is the domestic upshot. And the second upshot, which I think Christine will speak to in some more detail, but even if, I think the story of the hard right winning the election is a little bit overdone. They will do well. We expect them to broadly match the EPP altogether, all the hard right parties, and I include Fidesz. I probably include Fico at this point. I include AfD, ECR, and so on. Will probably match the EPP, but of course they won't have that level of influence because they're so divided amongst themselves. Notwithstanding recent efforts that we may have seen to recreate or to create a big hard right faction. But even if the hard right doesn't have, even if the centrist parties, the three centrist parties that currently form the von der Leyen coalition, even if they have a majority, it could still be quite difficult for von der Leyen to get a second term under those circumstances, because it looks like her three parties, so her EPP, the S&D and Renew, will get somewhere short of 400 seats in the parliament out of 720. She will need 361 seats, 361 votes to get a second term. It's an anonymous ballot. There are a bunch of people who've already said they're not going to vote for her. I don't know that forming a coalition, for example, with Meloni, as Jan was alluding to, is going to be the solution, because I think for every vote you win on the right, you probably lose 2 in the center and 3 on the left. So it's not clear to me that there's an obvious coalition that can be built as a result of these European elections. It could be that by July, we know who the next president of the European Commission is, and it's von der Leyen, and everybody lives happily ever after. It could also be, I think there's not a small chance that Europe ends up kind of stuck in a process of trying to find a new person who can build a coalition in the Council and in the European Parliament. And that by the time that second election comes around, the November election, we are still having a conversation around who leads Europe.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much, Stanley, for these insights. And I think that's a perfect segue into Christine's remarks to give us a little more detail on numbers, expected results, and the formation of political groups and indeed commission and other top jobs in the future. So I think Christine has also a slide to share, which our team will upload in a second. But over to you, Christine.
Thank you so much, Jan. And I'm delighted to be here with you and look forward to our discussion later. So first of all, I was asked to talk a little bit about the projection for the incoming European Parliament. So today the Netherlands vote, but yeah, over the next 3 days, the rest of Europe will follow. So let me start off with 2 projections, which you can see here on the slide. So the first one is from January. It's from the European Council on Foreign Relations, and it predicts, as you can see, everything to the right of yellow. The blues are center right, further right, or really far right, the idea. So what the European Council on Foreign Relations predicts is a majority coalition, and I'll talk about coalitions and policies in a moment, forming to the right of Renew, that's the Liberals in the European Parliament. That's from January. Quite a bit has changed. And I've also given you the latest poll of polls, it's yesterday's, from Politico, where you can see the different numbers for the different groups. The key thing that has changed since January, I would argue, is that Marine Le Pen kicked out the German AfD of the Identity and Democracy group in the European Parliament. What I would like you to look out for in the next weeks and possibly months, 3 questions, and they all relate to national political parties, which Stanley already talked about. So the first one, you see in gray on the European Council on Foreign Relations poll, and also in gray on the Politico poll, the so-called non-aligned members of the European Parliament. There are 2 key, now 3 key parties. Cinque Stelle, that's the 5-star movement of Italy, predicted to come in with around 13 seats, Will they join the Greens? Will they join the left? Or will they stay non-aligned? So that could give quite a bit of a boost to the left. The second party, very well familiar to all of us, Viktor Orban's Fidesz. Might he join the European Conservatives and Reformists? That's the middle blue in the European Council on Foreign Relations poll. Or will they stay non-aligned? So 2 parties to look out for. Second party or second group of parties to look out for are parties joining the parliament for the first time. So one key party to look out for, probably not in terms of numbers, but I think will be interesting, is Chega from Portugal, that has really made inroads, in particular on the issue of housing, similar to Geert Wilders in the Netherlands, in Portugal. So question of who they will join and who they will work with. The third one, again, already mentioned both by Jan and by Stanley, is the far right. So I would like to briefly focus on Marine Le Pen, who simultaneously expelled the German Alternative for Germany from her ID group in the European Parliament. So that happened on the 23rd of May, and approached Giorgia Meloni about a potentially super right group in the European Parliament. Now, the results, depending on the votes, could be the second biggest group in the parliament. But for me, and that's something Stanley just mentioned also, the far right and the sort of slightly more moderate right in the ECR are really divided on foreign policy. So broadly speaking, the ECR stands with Washington and the ID stands more with Moscow. So the question is whether they can form this super right group in the parliament. So 3 areas I would encourage everyone to look out for in the next parliament. So the first one is, will Europe continue to focus on competition and the single market? Or will Europe, following a little bit the American example, go into industrial policy and allow more state aid? First big question. Second one, the Green Deal, we've already heard about quite a bit. I think Europe, I'll talk more about that in a moment. It's a shared competence between the EU and the member states. And I think the future is not looking, or the next European Parliament is not looking great for the Green Deal. And the third point, we already heard a little bit from Stanley as well, is security. Now, one point Stanley made is absolutely crucial. There are no permanent coalitions in the European Parliament. And I first talk a little bit about the policies or the policy outputs that are predicted, and then a few words on the European Commission president. So if you look at the European Council on Foreign Relations work, then Kevin Cunningham and Simon Hicks use roll call votes from VoteWatch to show the coalitions in the outgoing European Parliament. So you've got the Grand Coalition, right? Conservatives, socialists and Democrats, and liberals. They usually won in policy fields such as budget, economic and monetary affairs, foreign affairs, the internal market, consumer protection, legal affairs, transport, and tourism. So that's the policies on which the Grand Centrist Coalition won in the outgoing parliament. There was also a center and left coalition, and that won very narrowly on civil liberties, sometimes on justice and home affairs, development, employment, social affairs, environment, crucially, keep in mind, and gender equality. And then there's a center towards the right coalition, and they won in areas like agriculture, fisheries, industry and research, and international trade. So the question is then, who will be able to form majorities in the incoming European Parliament? So the outgoing parliament, in addition to multiple crises, was very much dominated by Ursula von der Leyen's Green Deal agenda. I don't think this will be the case in the incoming parliament. I think the incoming parliament will focus on, first, implementation of laws that have already been passed. There's quite a lot going in or coming out. And that's the European Commission's job. And the parliament isn't really involved. And what we're going to see is, I think, a move to the right of the European People's Party. So the question is if the European People's Party, who I think in a sense will be a winner, not only becoming the strongest party, but also being the party to decide, do they want to go mainstream and left, or do they really want to move further to the right? If they want to move further to the right, I think what we can expect is much more support for economic, social, and political freedom for member states. And I think what we can also expect is that the small minorities of left, sort of center-left coalitions for the Green Deal, for example, gender rights and rule of law, will possibly vanish and not be able to carry those policies through the 10th elected European Parliament. So I think the Green Deal and the rule of law would really take a hit in the 10th Parliament. A few words about the top job, or one of the top jobs. I think the European Council President and the High Representative will be very much decided by the heads of state and government. But the key is whether Ursula von der Leyen will be able to win the 361 votes she needs. Last time she scraped through with a 9. Question is, will she be supported by the center and the center right? She has played a lot to Meloni, worked quite a bit with her. And the question is what that then means for the German government. Should von der Leyen do that? The SPD has already announced they would not carry her. And as Stanley already said, the vote is a secret. Or will the mainstream political parties who are close to getting possibly 350 to 400 votes, we will see on Sunday and Monday, will they stick together again and vote her in? If that doesn't work, right, I think the EU will really face a new situation of no one for the top political job, of course, right? Some names such as Mario Draghi's are in discussion, and for a future policy agenda. And
excuse me.
What we, yeah, I'm stopping.
Yes.
I'm giving my final comment. Exactly. So my final comment is that we've always seen right-wing votes in the European Parliament. What I'm more worried about is that we may not have a commission to lead in unstable European times. Thanks so much. Apologies for going over time.
Thank you, Christine. This was quite a tour de force indeed, and we'll have to come back to many of the issues that you raised. But let me bring in Milan, and perhaps Milan, you could help us make sense of some of the polarization that we've talked about, shifts, especially on the right. Perhaps you will focus on your regional area of expertise, Central and Eastern Europe as well, and also link this to some of the political violence that we've seen across a number of European states, if that is linked, and if so, how to the electoral trends that we just discussed. Over to you, Milan.
Thank you. Indeed, I want to focus on 3 things. One is clash of narratives about what these elections means, then a question of turnout, and then polarization and political violence that we have seen. On the clash of narratives, I think what we are seeing in Central Europe or eastern part of the EU is quite new and unprecedented. You don't have dominance of national topics. These are very international elections. There is a lot of backlash against the Green Deal, so EU-related topic, and then a lot about security. Because war in Ukraine is very close. However, these debates on security and Russian war in Ukraine are twisted, especially in Hungary, but also in my home country, Slovakia. The ruling parties are presenting it as a question between war and peace, as if voters electing members of European Parliament can have an impact on the battleground or on international diplomacy. Strangely enough, no discussions at all about the upcoming peace conference in Switzerland, but Viktor Orban masterfully presents this as if European establishment is pushing Hungary to join the war, and if you vote for Fidesz, then you are for peace. I'll come back to these topics, but let me maybe do a quick turnaround tour of 4 countries in this region, starting with Hungary. We have seen a start of new political project of Peter Magyar, who is originally from Fidesz. His party called TISA was pulling at around 20%. So quite unprecedented, given the fact that it started only a few months ago. However, it has attracted voters of the former opposition. Fidesz is holding on to its ground, and mind you, Hungary is sending to European Parliament only 21 MEPs. So the question whether Viktor Orban Fidesz will be pushed down 1 seat to, I don't know, 13, 14, or 11, in the big scheme of things is not that super important. The biggest country in the region is Poland. Poland sends 52 MEPs, and there the polls were projecting a quite tight race between the Tusk coalition. So it's Tusk government has 9 parties, but the main part of the ruling government, Platforma Obywatelska, led by Tusk, is polling at around 30%, and the former government, conservatives from Law and Justice, are polling slightly above 30%. In Czech Republic, populist ANO of former Prime Minister Babiš is leading, and the ruling coalition is trailing. But interestingly enough, these parties that in the European Parliament are part of the EPP or ECR are running together, which brings me to the main topic, I think, of these elections in these 3 countries. In Czech Republic, it is where will the winner, ANO of Babiš, end in the European Parliament. Andrej Babiš's party was part of the Renew, so the Liberals, but he's clearly populist, and in these elections he has shifted his party more to the extreme. He's leading the backlash against the Green Deal, against some policies that were very clearly associated on the EU level with the Renew. So I think he will leave. In a similar way, you don't know where Fico's party in Slovakia will end up, because they were suspended from the Socialists and Democrats. They are sending to European Parliament people that were led their radicalization and populist shift. I think I cannot imagine that although socialists will need numbers, and Fico can bring 5, 6 MEPs, so he will win. I think this is the effect of the shooting at him. This has changed the race in Slovakia, and the question of turnout, it was always important. Slovakia was at the bottom of turnout tables in previous elections, around 20%. Now I think it will show over 30%. Fico will win, but where he ends up, we don't know in the European Parliament. So the topic of regrouping of various political parties, their allegiance to be decided in post-elections backroom negotiations, I think it's something we don't discuss, because that will determine where the majorities are. Quickly about clash of narratives and main topics in these campaigns in various member states in Central Eastern Europe. I don't see much. I don't see any discussion actually about the key policy area that Christine picked up as number 1 for the next European Parliament and Commission, and that the EU regulation on competition, industry, tech, and so on, completely missing. China as well. You have on the contrary, you have a lot of these discussions around how Green Deal policies were overdone, how people's lifestyle have to change now, how the changes to energy mix are not prepared, the defense of combustive engines in Czech Republic much more than in Germany, and then the war. And last thing was violence. This will be my last point. In Germany, this was also unprecedented. I think the attack on the member of European Parliament from the SPD in Dresden Matthias Ecke when he was hanging campaign posters. It's something that I think was discussed, but I don't see any measures being taken. When Federal Interior Minister Fazer met with state ministers, they had a resolution which was nice, but it was conspicuous by outlining what needs to be done, rather what is being done. And also there were media stories that there was a clash, not on substance, but on who faces the cameras later. So I think when politicians are attacked, and they are attacked from all spectrum of the political spectrum, including from AfD, I think this needs to be investigated. It needs to be immediately sort of looked at. Courts should have a fast-track procedures, because we are in an age when this is going to get worse. And what happened in my own country, Slovakia, with the shooting at the Prime Minister Fico, had nothing to do with the European Parliament elections. But in his video speech after returning from hospital yesterday, he completely misused it into a very polarizing message, influencing election campaigns with a message to the voters that he blamed the opposition and the media for what happened to him, without any reference to police investigation and so on. So you have hatred, backlash, a lot of this sort of radicalization of politics, and hatred leading to attacks with the state with law and state and the governments being behind the curve. And I think this should be one of the lessons from these European Parliament elections.
Thanks, Milan. I'd like to invite everyone in the audience to come forward with questions by raising your hand or by posting them in the chat. And while you get ready, let me ask a few brief follow-up points to our three panelists. We touched on polarization and radicalization. We talked about rifts among the spectrum of the right, populist right especially. Now, I'm wondering, we've heard the revelations about Maximilian Krah in Germany, but we've also heard about the far-right troll factory scandal in Sweden with the Sweden Democrats, for instance. So there are a number of scandals within the spectrum of parties, and I'm wondering, to what extent is it really hurting these parties or not making a difference at all, or even benefiting their performance in the elections? That's one question. Perhaps a brief follow-up question for Christina as well, focusing on Germany. Voter age, is that going to make a difference? We haven't really touched on that yet. And then perhaps voter turnout in general. The last European election, I think, was the first that had more than 50% turnout in total. Is this something that's going to be achieved again? What are your predictions in terms of voter turnout, and also what sort of difference that might make? And perhaps we'll go in the same order again, and then as questions come in from the audience, we'll pick those up. So perhaps, and also please feel free to react to one another. You've heard each other's comments, so feel free to engage as well. Over to you, Stanley.
Yeah, I'll start with the far right question. I don't know that there's a huge amount. I don't know that scandals in other European countries play as much as people sometimes think they do in other countries. You will not find a huge amount on the problems of the Sweden Democrats in the French press, for example, or the Belgian press. These remain kind of local scandals. I would say the one exception to that was the AfD, where not only was he making some of his stupid comments to the foreign media, but also it kind of played into this complication of how radical is the far right. What we saw in France is that Marine Le Pen has absolutely no desire to be lumped with people who are of the same extremist inclination than her father, who she kicked out of her party. She has done everything she can to make the party more respectable and to kick out the people who were overtly racist and said unacceptable things. She is now not about to realign herself with a foreign party for that purpose. I think to Christine's point earlier, you know, the alliance in the far right, it's like magnets. Some of them will stick together very well, but some of them will repel each other with quite a lot of force. So I don't expect to see a coherent far right group. On the question of turnout, this is being watched very, very closely in Brussels. It was a matter of huge embarrassment for many years that the turnout was low and that it was falling. There was a real spring in the step of the European machine last time when turnout rose very significantly. Nobody really knows why. It's kind of one of those mysteries. It happened in some countries, but not in other countries. Everybody has a kind of pet theory, but I've never heard anything very compelling. So that will be the first number that I think people look at very closely. Can I finish off by Christina speaking next? And there's a question I want to ask to her, which is, why is an alliance with the Greens not kind of more central to the discussion that we're having now? The three centrist parties that backed von der Leyen broadly in 2019 have a little bit over the majority. They have 390 seats, give or take. That's probably not enough given the defections. You can look to the right, and that's what a lot of people are talking about. But why aren't we talking more about looking to the Greens? They would bring in about 40 seats. It would probably be enough, but it's not that much part of the conversation. Will it be part of the conversation, or is there a reason why it's complicated to extend that coalition to four parties?
Over to you, Christine.
Okay, let me start then with Stanley's question and then go to Jan's. So in Germany, it is debated. So I recently listened to an interview with Hertie, who's the lead candidate for the Greens. Would they vote for Ursula von der Leyen? Were she supported also by votes from the ECR? And Hertie Reinke basically said it would depend on what we could get in terms of policy promises. So I think my point was a little bit more about these different coalitions that formed in the past European Parliament, and would the projections be true? What could we expect sort of as policy focus in the next European Parliament? Where and how Ursula von der Leyen will get her votes from is probably something that she asks herself currently. I do wonder whether she is going to the Greens, how much she's going to the Socialists and Democrats, and how much she's going to the right. Because we hear a lot about Meloni, but we don't hear a lot, for example, about peace or for instance. So, yeah, my point was more about coalitions, but I think your point is absolutely valid. She could get a center majority, I think, in terms of the votes. To Jan's question, yes. So there are at least, I think, 5 countries in the European Union where this time, and some for the first time, like Germany, 16-year-olds can vote. The others are Belgium with compulsory voting, Bulgaria and Austria, and in Greece you need to be 17 to vote. Now, the question is, what will happen? So if you look at recent polls, I think we generally have the idea that the young are to the left, and that was definitely the case in the last European elections. I don't think that's the case anymore. If you look at the polls, about 30% of 14 to 29-year-olds, okay, that's broader than the 16, 17-year-olds, state that they might vote to the right, so possibly AfD. 25% say they haven't decided, and that's mainly young female voters. So what we've been doing is really go into schools in Berlin and really talk to kids that are 16, 17, 18, and really try to explain what's the European Parliament, why does it matter, what does the European Parliament do, how could your votes matter. Of course, we don't talk about political parties. It's quite interesting, the kind of discussions we've had. In terms of the survey I just mentioned, about 30% of the young vote is likely to turn out. So 30% want to vote right, 30% will turn out. Let's see. I think in general, the last elections, my last point, relates perhaps a little bit to the narrative that Milan talked about. I think the last elections were post-Brexit. Okay, Britain still voted, but was clear would leave. And I think the far right was very much shown, or at least in Germany, as wanting to take a country out of the EU. Now, the far right, although not in the least moving in the moderate direction, is now much more making, their campaign is much more about, we want to change the EU, right? That personally, I think, is much more dangerous in a campaign than mainstream parties being able to say, the right wing want to take us out. So I think that's also a narrative that has changed, I think, from 2019 to these elections.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. A quick reaction from Milan before I pick up the questions by Philipp Einwag and that's above in the chat.
Yes, and let me also address it, because I think what's interesting about these elections, and quite different from the last ones in 2019, is that we are seeing a virtual political death of the Spitzenkandidat process. You have only one name debated, and that is Ursula von der Leyen, who is not running, whether she will get the second mandate or not. And that will be, to a large extent, decided first in the European Council by the leaders, and only then in European Parliament. Now, she tried during her first mandate to work with the Greens or with her Vice President Timmermans on climate. But interestingly enough, if I remember well, with a narrow vote at the beginning of the previous European Parliament, the Greens were not part of the coalition that voted for her, right? But I think she tried to establish that coalition, to solidify it, but now it's playing against her in a way. Manfred Weber and the EPP leadership was cozying up to Meloni, knowing that Meloni will win the Italian contingent and will send a large number of MEPs, so they would need that around 30 MEPs. And the political tactics of the SD and Liberals and the Greens also is to basically put a leverage on the EPP, saying, if you make a backroom deal with Meloni, we are not part of it. So not only we don't have a clear choice at the ballot box because there is no Spitzenkandidat process anymore, and I don't think it was the right process, by the way, because it was a backroom deal between the political groupings, and even if you would have these names on the ballot in your national vote, it wouldn't matter. But who knows now the candidate proposed by the second largest group in the European Parliament, the Socialists, and what would it mean in my own country, Slovakia? That name of a Luxembourg commissioner would be on the ballot when you have completely different political offer presented by Smer social democracy, nominally called social democracy, but who are radicalized. They are not even far right. I mean, there are testimony that radicalization is not only radicalization and shift to extreme is not only confined to the right. So I don't know how the leaders will and the European Council will deal with this for the future. I don't see much political will and sufficient numbers or countries supporting transnational list, which was Emmanuel Macron's big topic. But what I see is that the next European Parliament will be even more than before a testimony to the fragmentation of European politics. Therefore, my topic of this European politics is political group, party politics or group, political families politics, and then this fluidity after so between the day after the European Parliament elections and the first inaugural session of the European Parliament, Stanley knows that better, but I think it's mid-July, a lot will happen. And the theme I tried to extract from let's say Czech Republic, that you don't know where the winner of the elections will end up in which political grouping. I think you have the same about France. With what will Marine Le Pen do? Stay in the ID. Italy, where will Meloni end up with ECR or EPP? Austria, Netherlands. So it's much more, I wouldn't say chaotic, but fragmented, and therefore a lot of it is a lot about political negotiations and the majorities, and linked to the election of the Commission President, which is a triumph of the European Parliament, but with many caveats.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Milan, for what I would interpret as a somewhat skeptical or perhaps pessimistic answer to the first question by Philipp Einwag, but I want to give the others a chance to react to this question about significance of European elections, European parties, perhaps the European candidates. Would it make a difference? Institutional reforms. We haven't seen a lot of progress on these things over the last legislature, so perhaps the others could react to that one as well. There's a question by Lutz Uphoff about the chances for Ursula von der Leyen to be the next Commission President. Again, I think, Stanley, you've done some calculations on probabilities, which you could share with us. But I also would like to pick up a question in the audience by my colleague Nasya Pokyumban. Please.
Hi, thank you very much for your contribution. I'm Anastasia Pochumban, and I'm a research fellow at DGAP. I wanted to ask you, how would you assess the elections? How will it impact enlargement, but also support to Ukraine? Thank you.
Wonderful. So thanks for bringing up Ukraine, and which we haven't really discussed at all. It wasn't among the list of top key drivers and topics by any of our speakers so far, but let's hear from them. Perhaps we go in reverse order this time, starting with you, Milan, and then Christina and Stanley.
To Nastya's question, support for Ukraine will be much more, I think, divisive in this next European Parliament, or let me put it differently. The group of best friends of Russia will be larger and will be much more determined. It will not be only in the ID or in the far-right groupings. It will be much more voiceful. And given the fact that the European Parliament does not have a direct impact on budgetary support to Ukraine, it comes with a bigger vote. I think it will be more of they will force these discussions in the European Parliament rather than have a direct impact. And on enlargement, let's see, but they will be the enlargement skeptics will be again a bigger group, and it might be a group which is distributed with among various political groupings. I think the skepticism towards enlargement will definitely come, of course, from people like Wilders, but also within the EPP or the Socialists, because I think we are not reflecting it, but there is much more reluctance to enlarge now in these confusing times in the constituencies where these people come from.
Thanks, Christina.
Yeah, fully agree with Milan on both points. I think as you call them, friends of Russia will increase. I also agree it's the European Council mainly that decides on the budgetary help for Ukraine. I do think security will be a top issue, and we see, for example, it's discussed whether there should be a security committee in the parliament, a security commissioner. I think security will be top on the agenda, although it's not really a European competence, right? It's very much a national competence. So yeah, I completely agree. I'm myself quite pessimistic that further enlargement will happen. If you look at Ukraine and the clashes we already saw in France and Poland when it came to agriculture and letting more agricultural goods in from Ukraine, I think that's not boding well for enlargement. And in terms of reform, I think that was a question either from the audience or from Jan. I mean, there have been some attempts. There was this German-French group of experts who published a report, very detailed, mainly focused on the rule of law and the single market. There was also a resolution by 5 European parliamentarians that passed very narrowly, but I don't think enlargement is possible without reform, and I don't see reform happening. So I'm, in addition to the challenges of for example, agriculture and costs, personally, I'm a little pessimistic about future enlargement.
Thanks. Over to you, Stanley.
Starting with the Spitzenkandidat, I think the Spitzenkandidat system is essentially dead. It died in 2019. I think it died the minute that Manfred Weber was nominated as the Spitzenkandidat for the EPP, because there was just no way that the European Council was going to agree to have somebody with no kind of high-level executive national experience lead the European Commission. What still exists is the Spitzenparty. You'll have to excuse, I'm probably confusing terms in German, but the idea that the candidate should come, the candidate for the European Commission should come from the biggest party, I think is still there. I mean, it is in the treaties that the European Council needs to react to needs to take into account the result of the elections. This leads me on to Ursula von der Leyen. Ursula von der Leyen is campaigning a lot, actually. If you look at her Twitter feed, she is, every day it's a new country. She's Finland, Germany, all around Europe. Weirdly, she's not campaigning to win votes. This is kind of the weird thing about European elections. Having Ursula von der Leyen come to your country is not going to help your party if you're the EPP. What she's campaigning for is the credibility in parliament, that she can show, I was your Spitzenkandidat. I went out there and I represented the EPP, and therefore you should vote, you should insist that the European Council nominates me, because that would be to respect the European Parliament. I don't know why she didn't stand for a seat in the European Parliament. She could have done it very easily, and I think maybe, in fact, it was a mistake not to actually stand for a seat. But thus, I think it will be very difficult for the European Council to turn around and say, we're going to take somebody else in the EPP, or we'll take somebody who's not in the EPP, someone like Mario Draghi, which I think is the only name that comes up as a potential alternative to Ursula von der Leyen at the moment. On Ukraine, I don't know that these elections are going to have a very defining role. The decisions on Ukraine are overwhelmingly made in the European Council, not the European Parliament. I think what would matter is whether or not Ursula von der Leyen continues in her role. She's obviously a firm Atlanticist, works very well with the Biden administration, might even work well with the Trump administration if that happens. Who knows? And that links into the broader debate also on enlargement. Again, if there is reluctance, and I think maybe there is, and I think I agree with Milan and with Christine that maybe there is some reluctance, it's going to come from member states. It's not going to come from Parliament. By and large, they have always been pro enlargement, or they certainly haven't been the limiting factor. The limiting factor is much more likely to be French farmers or Wilders voters than it is any political party in Brussels.
Thanks a lot. Let me pick up another question by my colleague, Julian Stöckler.
Yeah, thank you. My question was now partly answered already with that the elections are going to have no decisive impact on support of Ukraine, because most of the things are decided in the council. But maybe let me ask Milan maybe about what's the sense in Central and Eastern Europe in the population, but also in the kind of national broader political discussions about, I mean, one could think that now is kind of a good momentum maybe to maybe gradually integrate a little bit more on security, have a stronger European EU pillar in NATO against the possibility of a Trump return in the White House also. So is there kind of any sense of appreciation for cooperating more at European level, and for example, integrating by letting EIB finance defense, or any sort of joint procurement initiatives for defense and also for support of Ukraine? Is this sort of a appreciation for Europe as having a decisive role for financing defense in particular, but also for defense and support to Ukraine more broadly?
Thanks, Julian. Before I hand over to Milan to answer this question, let me pick up one more from the chat by Lacrosse Ben Crime, who's asking whether the outcome of this European election will lead to more fragmentation and then thus affect the cohesion within the EU institutions, and hence the role of the EU within and outside Europe as a whole. So that's Lacroix's question. And since this will probably be the last round of answers, let me throw in another question by myself. If we look at what happened over since 2019, since the last election, this legislature has been remarkable in many ways. We've seen the COVID pandemic and joined European action afterwards. We've seen Russia's invasion of Ukraine and again joined European action in various fields, unprecedented and to unprecedented extent. We've had talk about the Hamiltonian moment, et cetera, et cetera. So I guess my question is a rather sweeping one. Why hasn't Europe been able to benefit of these crises and chances to act together and continue to build the European project as a whole? So I suggest we go again in reverse order, starting with Mina and Christine, and then finishing off with Stanley. And again, feel free to pick up any questions that have been left unanswered so far, because we will have to close in about 4 minutes.
Very good. Let me try to tie your question, Jan and Julian, about defense commissioner and so on. You see, in countries that I pay close attention to, you see that there is a difference in how the EU is framed and viewed and very much part of discourse. In a fact that is much more accepted as the existential framework for these countries. You don't have so much Euroscepticism, but rather you have a reframing of the debate as even Viktor Orban says he wants to be stronger in Brussels to change Brussels or to reshape European policies. The same from former Eurosceptics in the Czech Republic or in Slovakia and so on. Having said that, however, there are no debates about European defense as such. I think it's accepted that there should be more defense and maybe even defense commission on the EU level. But when it comes to details, lack of competencies that Christine pointed to, the fact that the EU so far was described as a peace project, we will only have that later. It has not been part of the campaign because I think politicians followed polling and polls showed them that people listen more to the idea of peace and war, and they framed it like that, without actually describing what at the EU level you can change in order to contribute more to European security. And I think big exception is Poland. So another theme from this topic is that you have a divided Central Eastern Europe. This war divided Central Eastern Europe more than so the difference between the Balts and Hungary and discourse in Hungary shaped by Viktor Orban is enormous, and it will only grow.
Thank you very much for the questions. Maybe I would like to package Julian's question more in sort of, were Europe to do more on defense as the European Union, not as individual member states? It would cost a lot of money. The same, were Europe really going into just transition, for example, for decarbonization? Very expensive. And the third very expensive potential policy would be industrial policy. Right? We've seen sort of a draft from the European Commission, but at present, the state aid rules are or have continued to be relaxed. But that's highly problematic for the European Union, because the European Union was founded on the idea of competition through the single market and through regulation. If individual states, in particular Germany and France, who have big budgets, pay for their own industry, that totally distorts the single market. So I think three key policy areas that will be super important: defense, just transition, and potentially industrial policy, cost a lot of money. And if you look at debates about the multi-annual financial framework, that's usually where big discussions happen and also fights. So I am skeptical, not because I don't want this to happen, but because of the budgetary, in addition to the competence restrictions that the European Union has, that there will be a huge development in the area of defense. will still, I think, need to come from the national level.
Thanks. Over to you, Stanley.
Yeah, so two things. The first on fragmentation. I agree it's a theme. It's a theme in Europe, but it's not just at the European level, it's also at national level. We see these developments in member states as well. Maybe not so much in Germany, a little bit, but in places like Belgium, where I am based and which are having also national elections on Sunday, there are 12 parties represented in parliament. So just a quick statistic, in 1999, the two big parties, center-right, center-left in the EU got 75% of the vote, more or less. This time they'll get 43% of the vote. So, but that is a broader theme. On the second one, Jan, I completely disagree about Europe not having capitalized on its crises. You've more or less committed yourself to inviting me back to one of these things in future. I think the EU's response to the crises, whether it was COVID, whether it was Ukraine and the energy crisis, whether it was climate, has shown actual real purpose. And it showed the real value of having a European level to handle these things. There have been big shifts. The NGEU, although it's a one-off, the big post-pandemic recovery fund, I think it's not quite the Hamiltonian moment that people describe, but it's a big step, and we may see more of it with defense. And then more generally, I was in Brussels 10 years ago, and when I left, it was around the time of the Eurozone crisis, and you had a migration crisis, and there was a real sense that Europe caused more problems than it fixed, and it was a real kind of gloomy mood in Brussels. And now I come back 10 years later, and actually, Brussels didn't cause COVID. It wasn't responsible for Ukraine. It wasn't responsible for climate, but now they're bringing solutions. So I think for that reason, I disagree. I think Europe has acted together. There's a lot more of it that it can do. There's a lot more of it that it will do. And we'll see what happens after the elections.
Thanks, Stanley. Point well taken. I guess it's a question of the level of ambition, but we will be glad to invite you back. And indeed, we will continue the conversation, not just on the EU election. Small commercial block. We will have a special morning briefing on Monday morning, the morning after the election, which is already on our events page. We will continue with our regular Thursday morning briefings next week, covering the Ukraine Recovery Conference and the Switzerland Peace Summit next Thursday. Which will also be on our events page shortly. But for now, let me thank once again our excellent panel and you in the audience for your questions. Have a lovely day and a good rest of the week, and stay tuned for more from DGAP. Bye-bye.